Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. The risk of war in Ukraine has grown, according to U.S. officials, speaking to CNN and other news outlets, suggesting that the Russian Federation could invade Ukraine before the Olympics end, which is on February 20th. To discuss the buildup and what's going on the border with Ukraine, I speak today with Rob Lee, an FPRI Senior Fellow. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, and today we're talking with Rob Lee, who is a Senior Fellow at FPRI, about the increasingly likely invasion by Russian forces of Ukraine, perhaps as soon in the next week. Against the backdrop of the Olympic Games, there have been increasing reports from the United States, most recently from CNN. We are recording this on Friday, February 11th at about 12:30 p.m., that the Russian forces have completed their buildup or close to completing their buildup, and that U.S. forces estimate that the invasion can happen at any time to include before the end of the Olympics, which is on February 20th. So we're looking at perhaps as long as 9 days, but as little time as 1 day. To talk about the latest, Rob, why don't we just jump into it? You've written a few pieces for FPRI, which we'll link below, but perhaps you can give everybody an update about what's been going on and why the U.S. assessments have become so dire in the past couple of days.
Sure. So basically, for the last month or so, Russia and Belarus have been playing this exercise in Belarus called Allied Resolve. The first phase ended on February 9th. The second phase, the main active phase, is supposed to go from February 10th to February 20th. And basically, once they announced that, before they announced that drill, they mentioned December they were going to do some kind of drill in early 2022. They didn't really give many details. We saw in early January a lot of equipment from the eastern military district of Russia being moved on trains. It was, completely abnormal timing, everything else. That equipment started arriving near Belarus around January 17th, and that's when they announced this exercise was going to begin. And so since then, basically, since they gave those dates, February 9th has been made the most sense as kind of the date when Russia would likely have just about all the pieces in place if they wanted to conduct a significant military escalation. And that was because the buildup of the exercise was supposed to go until February 9th. And so that provided cover for Russia to move military equipment around Russia and to kind of justify it. Obviously, there's been a lot of things moved to Belarus, but it's also provided cover to, Russia's moving other equipment from elsewhere in Russia to the Russian-Ukrainian border. It wasn't going to Belarus, wouldn't take part in the exercise, but of course, just, movement of things on trains and kind of provide some kind of cover. So basically, at this point, the most recent reporting from the intelligence community is saying that they think that Russia has about 100 BTGs, that's battalion tactical groups, near Ukraine. From open sources, we can tell, most of that too. We can count, more than 94, 95. And Russia has 168 BTGs in the Russian military in total. That means we're approaching about 60% of Russia's total BTGs, which is a useful metric for ground combat power, is currently near Ukraine. And it looks as though it's continuing to increase. I heard that it might go as high as 110 or 120. And at that point, we're talking about 2/3 of Russia's BTGs will be near Ukraine. And when you consider how large Russia is as a country, the largest country in the world, to have them all concentrated in a relatively small area is a really dramatic and unique and unprecedented thing. So, in addition to BTGs are useful, and in some ways more useful metric than, say, we keep hearing that Russia has more than 100,000 troops in the border of Ukraine. That's not really that useful of a figure, because some of those soldiers, some of those servicemen are air defense or sailors. Some of them are conscripts. So not all of them will necessarily take part in escalation in Ukraine if they wanted to. Whereas the BTG figure is much more useful in that all these units, they're composed exclusively of contract soldiers, so volunteers, no conscripts. Conscripts are not supposed to be deployed outside Russia. They're not supposed to take part in combat. It's a really important domestic politics element to this, because when conscripts get killed, it becomes a really big issue for the domestic leadership. So all these contract soldiers, they're all permanent readiness units, and so they're all units that Russia could use to invade if they wanted to, whereas units with conscripts are not very likely to be used in that way. So having 100 BTGs, and typically they're ad hoc formations, but typically it's 600 to 800 servicemen in total for each BTG. That gives you about if all 100 of these BDGs are filled out with troops, that means there's about 70,000 troops, Russian troops near the border that could actually take part in an invasion. Another metric that the BDG figure doesn't catch are division or army or district level assets, which would never be attached to a battalion. So we're talking about S-300V, ballistic missile defense systems, Buk, medium range air defense systems, district level artillery like the 2S7 Malka, 203 millimeter heavy artillery piece, 2S4 Tulpan heavy mortars, Iskander M, army level missile brigades, all those kind of things. The issue is that all of those things are also in Ukraine too. So we've seen, in addition to permanently based units there, we've seen a few Iskander M brigades deployed from the Eastern Mid District, from the Central Mid District. We've seen S-300V systems from the Central Mid District in Siberia deployed. We've seen more recently a lot of short range aviation moving closer, so helicopters are being moving closer. Su-25 short range ground attack aircraft are being moved closer. So all of these things would be moved in place, and all of these things are things. If Russia was going to conduct a large scale invasion, these are the systems they'd want to have, because when Russia fights, they fight in a combined arms way, and they'd want to have all these systems. And so, as an example, the S-300V, it's the ground forces air defense system. It's a district level asset, but that's the one that's really designed to target ballistic missiles. And so Ukraine still has a number of Toshka-U tactical ballistic missiles. If Russia, fails to destroy them, and if they decide to invade, then S-300V systems are there to protect Russian forces from these missiles, right? So those are the kind of things that make direct sense and are very directly relevant to this kind of buildup. In addition to those forces, right, in Belarus, Russia has probably about more than 15 BTGs worth of equipment right now. They've also deployed 2 S-400 battalions from the Eastern Mid District. They deployed a Su-35 fighter squadron and a Su-25 SM ground attack squadron. They've also deployed some really high-end electronic warfare systems, the Krasuha-4, which is typically used to try to interfere with NATO reconnaissance aircraft like AWACS, possibly J-STARS. They've also deployed a really large naval grouping. So right now in the Black Sea, we just had 6 large amphibious landing ships from the Northern Fleet and Baltic Fleet moved to the Black Sea. So now I think they have 13 in total. They also have dozens of landing craft and fast attack boats. They deployed some of those in the Baltic Fleet as well. Right now, Russia is the largest or most capable amphibious naval capability in the Black Sea has had since the early 1990s. And it appears they're going to start deploying additional ships that are in the Mediterranean into the Black Sea as well. So that possibly includes the Marshal Ustinov, one of these Slavar Lankas cruisers. They only have 3 of them. One is permanently based in the Black Sea Fleet. Now they have the other 2 right now in the Mediterranean. One from the Pacific Fleet, one from the Northern Fleet. So again, all of this is unprecedented, and it's quite unique. And one way to look at some of the deployment of things in Belarus and some of these naval deployments is that they're not designed specifically to help in an invasion of Ukraine, but instead to deter NATO involvement if Russia decides to escalate in Ukraine. And so I think the ships make pretty clear, are pretty obvious why you use those. Part of it is to show the U.S. or NATO that if Russia escalates in Ukraine, that they can respond in a variety of regions if NATO decides to get involved. In addition, when you look at the S-400 battalions in Belarus, one of Russia's primary concerns if they ever get into a conflict with NATO is Kaliningrad, which is an exposed kind of area. Now you put S-400 battalions, Su-35S squadrons in Belarus. They can also kind of support or help defend Kaliningrad, and they can make the airspace around it contested for NATO aircraft. And so now Russia has a much stronger posture to defend Kaliningrad or in the case of an escalation with NATO. Then when you look at Russia's force right now, they have the most enhanced military posture in the European part of Russia since the early 1990s. There was one analyst who said that Russia has the fewest number of forces near China they've had since the 1920s. And they basically moved more than an army level unit from the Eastern Mid District. They moved units that are based, 70, 80 miles from North Korea into Western Belarus. They moved Northern Fleet units in the base of Murmansk. They moved things from everywhere, basically. So they're really pulling across the Russian military to mass right now. And the concern when you look at timing is that we're now in the active phase of the exercise in Belarus. The 6 amphibious landing ships from the Baltic and Northern Fleet just entered the Black Sea the last 2 days. So that's now in the Black Sea. If Russia does decide to bring in more ships from the Mediterranean, one date I heard was by the 15th. That gives you an indication of what they'll be moving then. But in addition, right now, all the Eastern Military District units in Belarus are getting a useful exercise to increase their proficiency, to work in terrain they hadn't worked in before. Basically, it makes sense that they get some kind of training out of the way before they would escalate. The other problems is that all the other kind of things we expect to see before Russian escalation are happening. So in addition to all that equipment I mentioned, so Russia already has more than 4 Iskander-M brigades right now near Ukraine. It looks as though more systems are deploying there. They'll probably have 5 by the if they decide to escalate. Russia has 13 brigades in total with 1 additional battalion. So we're getting to a significant proportion of the Iskander-Ms. There's a short-range ballistic missile systems. They have a ballistic missile option, cruise missile option. The stated official range is 500 kilometers to make it INF compliant, although we've seen tests that have gone beyond 600 kilometers, so clearly they have greater range. In addition to that, the Black Sea Fleet has more than 12, I think, ships and submarines that can launch caliber cruise missiles. We're seeing evidence that they're loading those up right now. Those have a 2,000-kilometer range, so they can hit anything in Ukraine. The Iskander-M systems in Belarus mean they can hit pretty much anything in Ukraine as well. So they have a really sophisticated. They deployed a lot of their fires assets at different levels. So there's Smerch, which are typically district level assets. The heavy artillery, the 2S7 Malka and 2S4 Tulpan. It deployed TOS 1A thermobaric systems. So they're deploying basically the whole range of fires we expect to see. And that's not even including aviation, and they've got obviously very capable aviation as well. The other things that have happened more recently is that some of the big assembly areas where a lot of the equipment has been pre-positioned for a long time, such as Yelnya, where the Central Mobile District's 41st Combined Arms Army has had equipment basically since September. Before that was at Pogonova. We're seeing evidence that is starting to clear out right now. So they're starting to move. And Yelnya is more than 200 kilometers away from the border with Ukraine. We're starting to see evidence they're moving that equipment to staging areas closer to the border, whether in Bryansk or Kursk or Belgorod. And I think the same is probably happening at Pogonova, another big assembly area. We're also seeing more evidence that there are troops arriving. So a lot of the equipment was pre-positioned, but they didn't necessarily have all the troops with it the entire time. So they had enough troops to kind of conduct maintenance, left the other ones back at their permanent bases. We're seeing evidence some of those guys are starting to get flown out right now. Basically, that's kind of the last factor here is that, and the issue of the whole buildup is that they've been moving the slow, the heavy, observable things earlier on. And so when you pre-position that takes time to move, and we can see it just from open sources. They basically took all those steps that take a long time already happened, and so the final steps we talk about. Okay, bringing troops in to fall on that equipment. The Russian Air Force is a very strong transport aviation. They can fly out large numbers of troops very quickly, in a less observable manner than with heavy equipment. And so the final steps can happen very quickly. And so basically, the timeline we're looking at right now, pretty much everything is in place. Pretty much all the heavy things are in place. If Russia decides to escalate at this point, they can do so on we're talking days notice, right? Not weeks notice, we're days notice at this point, and we might get to the point where it's hours notice soon. Another thing we've seen recently. We saw a large deployment of Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard troops in the areas of Russia near Ukraine. The kind of couple regions you might suspect Rosgvardia get deployed. One, if Russia wanted to occupy terrain in Ukraine, you might use Rosgvardia instead of your normal troops. Rosgvardia servicemen have been deployed to Syria, so they have taken part in these kind of exercises and operations. 2 other reasons, though, is one, if you wanted to ensure better operational security, before you took the preparations, final steps, such as flying those troops out from other areas, you might deploy Rosgvardia troops to set up checkpoints to prevent people from filming things, putting on TikTok, so things that we can see. So that's another step. And the third one is, I think there's a concern from Russia that Ukrainian intelligence or special operations units, that if Russia escalates, that those units might try to conduct sabotage in Russia near the border with Ukraine. And so another reason you might deploy Rosgvardia is to prevent against those kind of sabotage operations in the event Russia decides to escalate. Anyway, all those things point to, right, we're looking at a short-term high risk of an escalation right now. And I wrote a thread a couple of days ago talking about the kind of potential timing here. Basically all the stuff is in place essentially. And so I mean it could happen at any time, right? It could happen, on a day's notice at this point. As I said before, the exercise was to end in Belarus on the 20th, same day the Olympics was supposed to end. Russian officials have said all that equipment will leave Belarus at the 20th. The question is where that stuff will go. If they actually de-exercise and they finish it, most of that stuff has been moved from the Far East. Some of it is from the airborne forces, but most is Eastern militia equipment. And so there's a question of where do you move that? And do you move back to Russia, near the Ukrainian border? Do you move all the way back to the permanent base? If you do that, right, it takes months to deploy that stuff again. That will take a long time. As long as that equipment is based near Ukraine, the risk of escalation will remain high because ultimately they deployed the pre-positioned, the heavy stuff, and they can move out troops anytime they want to pretty easily. So Eastern militia equipment is one of the key things to look at in the future, what Russia decides to do with it. As long as it's near Ukraine, the risk of an escalation is high. The other issue we talk about is the ground. There are always videos of mud or debates about how solid the ground is. Clearly in the southern parts of Ukraine and in parts of Russia near the border, like in Rostov or Crimea, there's plenty of mud at this point. But when you look at timing, the weather will likely the situation of the ground will get worse probably in a month or so. And so if Russia is planning on escalating, it makes more sense to escalate in the next 2 or 3 weeks than it does to wait, a month or more. That doesn't mean they can't do it, right? The ground conditions they're a factor, they're not determinative. But if Russia was dead set on doing this and they wanted to get the best ideal conditions, it's more likely to escalate sooner rather than later. And if you're not going to escalate over the next couple weeks in February or March, you'll probably wait until late spring, early summer at the earliest to do it again. So we're looking at a timeline. There's a bit of a clock on it, where if Russia wants to escalate, it makes most sense to do it soon and not wait, a month or later. So that's one of the big elements that we're talking about. And the same thing is, Russia can keep equipment there for a while. So they can keep some of the stuff in Belarus if they want to. They can move some of the stuff to Russia. The issue, though, is the longer you keep Russia, they have something like 60% of their ground combat capability near the border of Ukraine right now. That's a massive amount. I'm not sure they want to keep that share near Ukraine for the medium or long term. And so it makes more sense to keep that in the short term. Also, if you keep some of these troops, the Eastern militia guys are currently living in bivouacs and tents in Belarus. You can do that, right? You can keep those guys there for a while. Morale will go down after a while, right? And so all of these things that they're not determinative, right? Russian troops could stay there and they could stay for a couple of months and still escalate. But if you're trying to find ideal conditions for your military, it makes more sense to escalate, pretty soon if Russia's deciding to escalate. Otherwise, to maybe pull back the posture somewhat and maybe wait for later. So that's kind of the risk. Obviously, I can't see the intelligence that the U.S. intelligence community is providing. One thing I'll say is the assessments they were giving back in November, early December about 100 BTGs, that has proven accurate, right? And so their concern has proven accurate. That Russia has moved a lot of equipment. A lot of this is unprecedented. Iskanders in Belarus is unprecedented. Eastern militia stuff moved this far away is unprecedented. Amphibious ships in the Black Sea, unprecedented. A lot of things are unprecedented. So clearly, they got a lot of those things right. One thing that is still a bit of a question to me is that the early reports, I think when Washington Post reported this, was that the U.S. intel community expected Russia would have 100,000 reservists as part of this. We still haven't seen evidence of that. So there's a new reservist program Russia's been using. They announced in August called BARS. It's supposed to be more of a kind of, I guess, NATO type reservist program where you have volunteers. They sign a contract, they get paid more, and they drill, I don't know, once a month, maybe a week or so a year. A completely new program. We haven't seen it before. And it seemed as though it was very rushed. It was like a real crash course in implementation, which I think is what really concerned the U.S. Intel Committee or the intelligence community back in August, September. They've done some exercises in both the southern and western military districts, but the size has been quite small. So, I mean, even if we buy the numbers the Russian military is given, we're talking about less than 30,000 in both district, nowhere near the 100,000 figure. And of course, at this point, it's pretty clear that Russia is doing a buildup. Everyone knows there's a risk of war right now. It's a question of whether or not you want to sign up directly to go to war or to support this. I don't know. So that's one question mark basically. But other than that, everything else is basically there. And now we're at the point where the capability side is there. It's now about reading Russian intentions. Looking at what's happened last year, the rhetoric, so much Russia's behavior has been unprecedented. So not just the military side, but we look at the demands that came out in December. There were very specific ultimatums. They gave a deadline. They said we need to get this resolved very quickly. Russian officials committed to a military technical response. They didn't get what they wanted, and we keep seeing these meetings between Russian officials and NATO or U.S. officials, with Lavrov and Truss the other day, and they keep not really achieving much, right? And it's not to say that they're bad to do, but every time Russian officials basically come away and say, we're expecting you to make concessions. They're essentially unilateral concessions, and if you're not going to make them, then we don't really care. There's not much to talk about. And so they keep kind of communicating that line. And so ever since December, right, we had this buildup, and you had Russian officials deliberately putting themselves in a corner where either they receive concessions, they escalate, or they face a cost to credibility. The position is just bad, right? And at this point, I think from Russia's perspective, my view is that this is mostly about Ukraine. That was their key problem, and that was the pressing issue. And it was partially about Ukraine's political orientation, partially about Ukraine's growing defense cooperation with NATO and just growing conventional deterrence capabilities in general. Well, the things that Russia's achieved so far in this buildup is. So I think there's, I would say arguably greater NATO unity right now, but also you've seen much greater NATO armed support for Ukraine. So the U.S. keeps sending more javelins and other weapons. The UK continues to send more and more weapons. We've seen the Baltics, Poland, and other countries also provide a lot more support. And so if Russia were to back down now, or at least not to escalate, there's a question of what lessons would NATO draw from that? And it's pretty clear the lessons would be A, we have to stand up to Russia. That's the only way Russia learns. B, our arms exports and our support to Ukraine was decisive, and basically all those are lessons Russia does not want NATO to take away from this. There's no reason to think that if Russia backs down or doesn't escalate, that NATO will stop providing arms service to Ukraine. There's no reason to think that Kyiv would change its political orientation. If anything, it might become kind of more anti-Russian in terms of some of its domestic policies. And so that's kind of concern to me, is that there's a cost of backing down. And so there's also a cost of escalating, but there's a cost of not acting and a cost of backing down. And so all of that, I think, shapes Russia and the Kremlin's kind of view of what are the cost-benefit analysis of escalating here. And then personally, I think when Putin decided to do this buildup this time, I think he kind of tacitly accepted that depending on how events go, if we don't get what we want, we may have to use military force. I personally think he accepted that back in September, October. And I think that's the concern right now, is that the most recent moves show that there's an impasse between NATO and Russia. It's not getting resolved. There's no reason to expect it's going to change. And Russia basically said, look, if we don't get what we want, military force is our last resort. And it seems we're at that point where that resort, the last resort, is going to be used.
So let me ask you this, and we'll wrap up here because that was a very comprehensive answer. There's been multiple reports that I think probably at the lower end of U.S. estimates is that if the Russians go for a large-scale invasion, and of course they have options presented to them about how they would invade, is that the capital of Kyiv could be surrounded, or perhaps even sort of occupied within 48 hours of Russian ground force movement. Where do you think those estimates are? I'm not asking you to look at U.S. intelligence estimates, but give a sense of people who maybe aren't familiar with the geography of how the Russians could achieve those aims in relatively quick fashion once they begin actual ground invasion, not just salvo fires or fires from different systems that you described, or even from aviation.
Sure. So when you compare the disposition of Russian forces now to, say, last spring when they did build up as well, there's a much greater capability on Ukraine's northern border. So part of that is in Belarus. Some of the stuff has been deployed, near the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. Obviously, Kyiv is not far from the border with Belarus. The terrain around there, a lot of it's kind of marsh areas, so it's not the best ground, but it's quite close. And then even from the Russian side of the border, it's only a little over 100 miles from the closest point of the Russian border to Kyiv. And so we're not talking massive distances here. It's not that large. And so if they want to make a quick move to Kyiv, they can do it. The question is, I don't know as much about the Ukrainian military disposition, so I don't know how much resistance they'll see. If you make a very fast movement to Kyiv, you obviously take risk, right? But because your supply lines wouldn't be secure necessarily, or you'd have to send in very light units initially, which could be in trouble if they run into a lot of resistance. So there are risks associated with that if Russia attempts that move. Although I think what they want to achieve is, if they escalate, they want to be as fast and lethal as possible. And I think the reason is you want to basically, before people can get the situational awareness of what's happening, right, and kind of think about what they want to do and whether they want to respond and so on, you basically want to achieve your objectives already, and so you basically make resistance not worth it. So that is entirely possible. They try and make a very rapid movement to Kyiv. I suspect Russia already has plenty of intelligence officers, I'm sure, on the ground in Ukraine already. It would make sense that they try to deploy Russian special operations units to do something like that. That's a possible course of action they could attempt. Of course, you bring in heavy kind of motorized infantry and tank units behind them on that way. I think that's an option. I think absolutely Kyiv is a move towards Kyiv makes sense. That's one option. I personally think that the most likely options are still really focused on the Ukrainian military. It's really still about compellence. So trying to inflict pain on the Ukrainian military to try and force Kyiv to make certain political concessions. Right, that would otherwise be too politically costly or unpalatable to do or to consider. And so that that leads me to believe it'd be more about killing Ukrainian soldiers, taking POWs, destroying Ukrainian military equipment, degrading Ukrainian capabilities as kind of military goals of what they try to achieve. And so if that's the focus, the goals would be less terrain oriented and more kind of enemy oriented, right? Focusing on the military units, less focus on terrain necessarily. I don't think occupation is the most likely option. I think it is an option Russia might take if they can't get their objectives through less use of force. However, right, Russian forces could still focus on targeting Ukrainian military units, first with fires, possibly punitive raid with a short timed kind of operation, ground offensive, and then the last option is the movement to Kyiv, because that's a one way when you put President Zelensky in a kind of untenable situation, right? Especially if you put forces right outside Kyiv or in Kyiv, immediately it changes the kind of the calculus there. And I think the hope is if Russia can be fast enough and lethal enough, right? And they can, I have no doubt any operation would involve cyber, would involve a lot of electronic warfare systems, try and disrupt Ukrainian command and control, communications, all those kind of things. That the hope would be we try to achieve our objectives so quickly that we basically convince everyone to not try and fight against us. So that's, I think, where that 48 hours kind of thing you're hearing about comes out. I think that's more of a most dangerous kind of course of action. I don't know. I don't think it's the most likely. I think it's possible, but ultimately it comes up to Ukrainian forces how much they resist. If there's resistance, and if they can also make some of those roads kind of less passable, that can slow down things. But we're trying to make educated guesses, so it's hard to kind of be certain about these things.
So last question here, and then we'll sign off. A lot of the sort of assessments about the impact on U.S. and European security have been about sort of big picture things, which is the return of a land war in Europe, the expected number of casualties on the Ukrainian side, and what that means for sort of security ties between Russia and the European Union and NATO more broadly. I'm going to ask a more focused question just to finish this out. The U.S. response to this is going to be in this currently, which is to send perhaps the most forward-leaning things, which is aircraft to Romania, but also to Poland, perhaps some others. What do you think the risk is, of force-on-force interactions over the Black Sea and perhaps over the Baltic Sea between American and Russian forces? Because I believe they're also in Latvia as well. So that's the third one I'm looking for. What should we be concerned about other than just the perhaps sort of big picture changes to European security in general? and more towards the force-on-force friction between U.S. and Russian forces moving forward?
So, I mean, look, the risks are elevated. I don't think Russia wants a conflict with NATO. I don't think they see, there's much to gain there. Obviously, when we talk about the risk to Ukraine, part of that risk is because Russia doesn't want them as part of NATO, and they know how much of a problem it would be if Ukraine became NATO and had Article 5 and then had, fell under the U.S. and other NATO members' nuclear umbrella. They don't want that to happen, and so that's part of the reason why they're escalating now. I think in the Black Sea there is a risk. It really depends. Russia may come out and say basically, we don't want anything over the Black Sea while we're doing this. And I'm not sure how NATO aircraft would operate. Obviously, there's always a huge reconnaissance effort by NATO aircraft in the Black Sea around Kaliningrad. We've seen some of those over Ukraine recently with J-Stars, picking up information on Russian forces. I suspect Russia will, at a minimum, will use EW to try and interfere with those aircraft. So Krasula 4 are a good example of what they'd use. I also think if they escalate in Ukraine, I think we would see, a pretty aggressive use by Russian fighters over the Black Sea to we would shadow or escort any NATO aircraft that moved around there. And I think it's entirely possible that we'd see some very dangerous intercepts. We haven't, one thing that's notable, we haven't seen many dangerous intercepts, unprofessional intercepts between Russian aircraft, Russian ships, and NATO aircraft or ships over the last year or so. So the last time we saw some really dangerous ones was the U.S. deployed B-52s back in August of 2020, and they did a couple flights over Ukraine, right near Crimea, over the Black Sea, and there's at least one or two cases where Russian fighters, I think one did a barrel roll right in front of B-52, and so that was the last time I think the U.S. Accused Russia of having a unprofessional intercept at air. I think it's entirely possible that if they decide to escalate, they would put out kind of a message saying basically don't come here or we will respond aggressively. After the HMS Defender incident in June or July, I think it was June, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, he literally said basically to the UK, said, if you try this again, you'll get punched in the mouth. Right. So, I mean, he literally was making those kind of threats. Earlier than that, during the buildup in the spring, he also said, I think it was in April, there was news that the U.S. might send a frigate into the Black Sea as a routine thing. I think he literally also kind of suggested that, things might happen if you send it here. It's a dangerous place to be. Don't do it. Something along those lines. So basically hinting that, there might be some kind of unprofessional intercept and things might get dangerous. And obviously after the HMS Defender incident, there were a number of kind of unprofessional and dangerous incidents where Russian aircraft were flying very close to. There was a Dutch frigate that was in the Black Sea at the same time that was getting just constant kind of low passes by Russian aircraft. I'm not sure they actually said dangerous, so let me take that back. But certainly some risky things. The same thing happened with U.S. Frigates operating in the Black Sea. And again, the Russian officials, as part of this buildup, they've mentioned, they're not happy with what's going on in Ukraine, but they're also not happy with NATO presence in the Black Sea in general, right? And so part of that is support for Ukraine. Part of that is just general operations in Ukraine and in the Black Sea. And so this is something they would likely push back against. And if they do deploy the Marshal Ustinov or the Admiral Kazatanov, Northern Fleet ships to the Black Sea, they're going to have a really elevated presence there. Again, we'll see. It's hard to be certain about this, but it's certainly possible that they would be more aggressive about intercepting, shadowing NATO aircraft and ships in the Black Sea if they decide to escalate. And I think what they're hoping is that they have such a strong military posture there that it deters NATO from even thinking about flying over there or doing anything along those lines. And again, it is a question. Right now, I'm not sure if NATO is still sending reconnaissance aircraft over Ukraine. But of course, if Russia escalates, is NATO going to keep doing that, or are they going to keep, will they park their aircraft back in Poland and not, go right over Ukrainian airspace at a risk? It's a lot of kind of real important considerations to make. I suspect they'll keep flying over Kaliningrad. That will continue. But again, the risk will be elevated because it will be. And I think politicians have said this. It will be one of the most dangerous, periods of time in European security in decades, and the risk of a really kind of large scale conventional conflict is probably greater now than any time in decades. And so, we shouldn't underestimate the danger of the current situation, and depending on how it goes.
Well, with that, Rob, thanks for joining me on short notice. This was kind of an emergency pod here for the Chain Reaction podcast, but I thought it was warranted because given the fast-moving pace of events. So if we do get an invasion in the next week, we'll probably have you back on to discuss what's going on. So with that, Rob, thanks for joining me, and thanks everybody for listening.
Next time on Chain Reaction, we continue our special series on climate change and national security with FPRI's Clint Watts. In the second episode, Clint speaks with Dr. Jola Ajibade, Assistant Professor of Geography at Portland State University, about how different global communities are migrating or adapting to climate change. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.